how this conference has been. It is at 5:05 on the last day. This is a roundtable, so there are no discussants, there are three presenters on civil society and how civil society activism has tried to tackle matters of global climate. Because the first speaker, Duncan Wigan, has to catch a flight to the airport, I want to quickly introduce him. There was an earlier reference made to George Orwell, and Duncan, in my mind, leads me to two associations with George Orwell. The first, his surname is Wigan, which is a city in the northwest of England, and Orwell wrote a book called The Road to Wigan Pier, which ended with a plea for a fairer society. The second association is Orwell's essay on politics and the English language. It was an assault on the euphemism of political language. And Duncan doesn't mince his words, and that's how I would like to introduce him. In his article in 2013 on financial derivatives was titled Fiscal Weapons of Mass Destruction. That's number one. The second thing, he's involved in a large-scale research project involving 1,400 researchers. And that one is called STEAM. Now, listen carefully. Systems of Tax Evasion and Money Laundering. So, Duncan, please, his history of tax justice network.
Yeah, and the lesson there is you need a good acronym to get some money. Okay. When I was leaving home, when I was leaving home, my wife said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm going to do some research on issue emergence in transnational activist networks." And she said, "Oh, what are you going to talk about?" And I said, "Oh, I'm going to talk about NGOs." And as I walked out the door, she says, "Come on," she's a lovely Scottish lady, she said, "Dinny teach your granny to suck eggs." So I left rather deflated, and I'm still nervous. I was thinking of calling it this, but we have an alternative title. I'm working with my colleague and friend Leonard Seabrook on this, and we're calling it Getting Action on Global Tax Justice. And what we think is really important here is the role of professionals and the role of identity switching, particularly when economic justice issues are very, very complex and multidisciplinary. So I'll try and rush through this for you. Okay, what's interesting, I'm going to speak about TGN. I've been sort of following them off and on like a bit of a groupie since 2003. And what's interesting about TGN in their 10, nearly 11 years now is the amount of influence they've had on global tax policy. This is TGN's headquarters, and it provides a bit of a puzzle for us, because even in building it, John had to use the indentured labour of his son. So we have an organisation that is very, very short on resources, and normally we explain activation in networks on the basis of the characteristics of the issue, very emotional, very emotive, or the strength, the resources of the organisation. And obviously from this slide we can see that until very recently TGN was rather skint. In fact, I think until 2006 you only had one employee, and him indeed not claiming much of a salary. Okay. What do we mean by identity switching? I think to get activation within networks, you need to have people that can cross into, traverse different social domains. So let's take Jim if he's still in the room. Jim is an activist. He hasn't been in policy, but he's got huge scientific knowledge. He can produce big numbers, and he's got massive corporate experience. John, corporate experience, he's an economist, he's been in policy, and he's an activist. So these individuals are able to cross social domains and form networks on each level, and I think that's incredibly important of gathering credibility and catalysing action across the domains necessary on issues such as tax justice. Okay, so the kind of framework we're using is this idea that you draw authority and credibility in one domain and you take it into another domain where you catalyse action. I have four tactics. I mean, there are many more, I'm sure, that I want to talk about today. The first one is berserking. We take these from interviews. Berserking comes from Old Norse. They used to have the royal guard used to be sent out in times of battle to disturb, agitate, confront, as shock troops. And I think we got a little bit of example from John earlier about what that might involve. Narrating. You need to have scientific expertise. You need to be able to tell subversive stories which are actionable and credible to get activation in policy and activist domains. Cornering is the most sneaky one, and I'll come back to that in a second because I'm going to try and rush through a bit, but you'll get a nice example of it. And templating is actually providing solutions to specific problems and relies, again, on scientific expertise and activation across the other three domains. Okay, the first one is beautiful bird. The first thing that TGN do, they're a very, very small, loose organisation, if they're really an organisation at all. I think they're a form of organising rather than an organisation. But a peacock is a very small bird, but it has a mechanism of looking very, very big. And I'll give you an example of this. Right. If we have a search for tax justice on the internet, we see, oh my word, look at all the different organisations that are talking about this, but when you look a bit closer, they're all TGN in different guises, so they're looking a lot bigger than they really are. Key tactic number one, I think. Second tactic, narrating, telling stories to subvert the dominant narrative, and that's what TGN are often doing. The most famous one is to change the language, change the very language of capital, but specifically in this example, to change the very language of tax abuse, and to change it from being denominated as a peripheral phenomenon that occurs in something called tax havens. Havens are nice and safe and cozy, everyone wants to go to one, to talking about secrecy. And what you do when you use this language, you change the imagination of the problem. Who is number 6 here, the USA? We don't normally call the USA a tax haven. There's Germany, that was annoying, yeah? But we changed the whole metric and we point to the problem as being a systemic issue, and we also point to the specificity of the problem in terms of secrecy, as another presenter noted earlier. Okay, the other example of narration I'm going to use, and there are other ones, the 1 trillion that Mette uses to convince Europe that we need policy change. But this is Jim's number, 13 trillion pounds, which is hidden and secreted offshore, and the bottom of the graph shows you the interest that this particular number generated. Jim couldn't have done that without expertise, scientific expertise. It's incredibly important. And unfortunately, I couldn't get the cover of The Economist, which would have been even more impressive. We did. Here's another one. This is cornering. Yeah. And this is really sneaky. Now, I was listening to the radio during the UK Public Accounts Committee grilling of the tech companies, blurry-eyed in the morning, and I hear John's voice and my ears pick up, and John Humphrys speaking about a respected campaigner, John Christensen, who gives his opinion. And then John Humphrys turns to the next interviewee, and it's a professor of accounting from Essex University, who somehow arrives at the very, very same opinion. And then the third interviewee, just to make sure we've got full balance here, the third interviewee is Sol Picciotto, and he is a professor of law emeritus at the Anati Institute in Spain. John Humphrys wrapped it all up. We've got one story, and that is what cornering is. A very, very useful tactic, I think. The last tactic, and obviously a really important one at the moment, is providing solutions to complex problems. And Richard Murphy drafted the country-by-country reporting standard in 2003. In 10 short years, it's the object of global policy discourse, and it's a possible reality, and it's a reality in partial form in the US and Europe already. What's really interesting in here in terms of networks and NGO networks is Publish What You Pay generally owns this issue in terms of the extractives, and TGN went in there and did a bit of berserking, I think, and said, you guys quote from interview, NGOs don't get counting, so we need full numbers, because we don't have full numbers, we don't really know where the money goes. Publish What You Pay had been asking only for payments to governments as a check on corruption. TGN suggested, no, we need full accounting data, because then we know where all the money goes. Circumventing a technocratic, enclosed, private authority called the ISB. Now, where's the person with the time? How am I doing? Am I I'm doing it? Okay. Now, this one is John. Now, another thing that TGN do is they get access to events and then you go bonkers. So I'll take two examples. I mean, there was the UK PAC hearing where Richard was invited in on the basis of his policy links and obviously on the basis of his scientific expertise. Now, I was watching that on video and I saw Richard doing this and I thought, he's blogging again, won't he just bloody listen? And I phoned him after and said, what were you doing? Why didn't you listen? And he said, no, I was listening very carefully and I was sending questions to Margaret Hodge, who was the chair of the meeting. Another example which John has given us is at Chatham House in a meeting on CSR. Invited there John, the ex-chief economic advisor to Jersey, and indeed a provider of these odious services at one point in his life. And at the end of the meeting, and dressed very smartly, even nicer than he was today, John stands up and starts shouting, "You've got to think about poor people!" And I think that's incredibly, I think it's important. I also wonder what lessons we can draw from this when we see a new issue emerging in an attempt to graft an attempt to graft the tax issue onto another area, and I think the answer has been provided in this conference, and I see plenty of people that can perhaps play the very same roles. Maybe I need to stand back. So let's try and find those individuals, not just the experts in human rights, and not just the experts in tax, but the experts who can broker between those areas. Those are the people that are going to, given this analysis, which I'm running away so I don't get told it's total bullshit, but given this analysis, I think we need to find those experts, and we need peacocking, we need cornering, we need berserking, and we need narrating, and we need cornering. So.